In this hands-on lab, we'll walk through configuring both section titles and some inline layers. So if you are logged on to the CPT Nuggets website, you can click on the link for the virtual lab associated with this nugget and get hands-on practice as we go through this together. Let's create two sections, a section called Management and a section called HQ User Traffic. And then further, let's go ahead and create inline layers, specifically one inline layer with the child rules for our management traffic and another inline layer with the child rules that we want to apply for user traffic at our headquarter location. So we'll start here on our client PC. We'll go ahead and log on as admin to our security management server at .110, and we'll supply our lab password and click Login. In Smart Console over here on the left, we'll click on Security Policies to bring the security policies up. So our first objective is to create sections, and it's so easy to do. What we're going to do is simply right-click where we want to add the section to. So we'll right-click on the rule number, in this case rule number 1. And then from the drop-down, there's an option for New Section Title, and we can put it above or below the current rule that we have selected. So I'm going to put it at the very top, so I'm going to click on Above. And let's go ahead and call this Management Section. You don't have to call it a section. It might be a little bit redundant, but from a learning perspective, every time we see it, if we think, oh, that's a section title, that'll be helpful for the learning process. So we'll call that Management Section. And because we only have one section, it assumes that we want all rules 1 through 5 as part of that section. So that'll stay that way until we add another section. So our other section is going to be user traffic. So let's go ahead and scroll down a little bit. And on rule number 4, from inside to outside, when we created that, the intent of that was for our user traffic. So with rule 4 selected, we'll right click, and from the drop down, we'll say New Section Title above, and we'll click on the title name. And let's name it HQ User Traffic and press enter. And then we can resize this a little bit, see a little bit more. I'm going to use this icon right here to collapse all sections, and then scroll up so we can see it. So we've got the management section, which has rules number 1 through 3, and then we have the HQ User Traffic, which is encompassing rules 4 and 5. And in fact, that last cleanup rule, which is a default, let's go ahead and just add a section for that as well. We'll do a right click on rule 5, select New Section Title above, and let's call that Final Cleanup. So anything that's not matched earlier in the policy, we'll hit this Final Cleanup, which matches on everything, and we'll subsequently drop it. So goal number 1 of creating section titles, that is done. Our second objective in this lab is to create some inline layers. So let's create a parent rule for management traffic. We'll also create a parent rule for user traffic, and then we can use inline layers to specify the details of what we want to permit or deny inside of each of those groupings. So let's start off with our management traffic. I'm going to click on rule number 1. We'll simply right click and create a new rule, and let's put this at the top or above our current rule number 1. So we'll click on above, and let's call this parent rule CP Management, meaning our management traffic, either from our administrative PC or from our security management server. And for that match, what we want to do is we want to match on traffic from either the management PC, and I'm just going to drag and drop the objects, or from our management server. So instead of picking it from the picker, we can simply drag and drop that object if it exists somewhere else in the policy. So here, rule 1, traffic source from either of those two IP addresses represented by these objects, going to firewall 1 or firewall 2, and just dragging those up there as well. And regardless of the service or application, and instead of the drop, now here's how you add the inline layer. Instead of saying the action is drop, we're going to specify with the drop down for the action column, we're going to specify here an inline layer. Now at the moment, we don't have any inline layers created, but once we do, if they're reusable, they'll show up in this list. So what we can do here is specify we want a new inline layer that we're going to use as child rules under rule number 1. So we'll click on New Layer. We have a pop-up for that. And let's name this Inline Rules for CP Management, meaning Checkpoint Management. We can also specify the types of services and options that might be available in this inline rule. For the moment, I'm just going to leave Firewall checked. And also in the editing of this layer, we could also specify permissions. So if we click on the permissions section here on the left, we could go ahead and specify individual administrators and what they could or could not do permission-wise regarding this inline layer. So at this point, we don't have a lot of other users created other than admin, so we'll leave that alone for now, and we'll click on OK. And let me make that column a little bit bigger. There we go. So notice here in this parent rule called CP Management, it's matching on traffic from the management PC or the server going to either firewall, regardless of service or application. And the action is going to be use the child rules identified by the inline layer called Inline Rules for CP Management. Now, by default, we just have a cleanup rule. That's all that exists there. But to add additional child rules, it's really easy. We simply right-click on 1.1, and then specify new rule, click on above, and it would add a new rule as part of this inline layer above the existing 1.1. So if we click on above, we have a new 1.1, and the old 1.1 got pushed to 1.2. So let's call this new child rule as part of this inline layer. Let's call it inline rule for management. And then regarding what we want to match on, we could go ahead and start dragging and dropping. So for rule 1.1 is traffic from the management PC going to firewall 1 or firewall 2, just dragging and dropping those objects. And then we can go ahead and bring in SSH and HTTPS. And I think that's going to cover everything we're going to need from the management PC going to those firewalls. And we want the action for this inline layer rule. We want it to go ahead and accept, meaning to allow that traffic. So here we have the older rule 2 and 3, and we no longer need those. So we can simply right-click on rule number 2, and from the drop-down select delete. Click on yes to confirm, and do the same thing with the other rule, which was rule 3, which is now rule 2. Right-click, from the drop-down select delete, and click on yes to confirm. All right, and so now the remaining rule number 2, the management server to firewall 2, allowing all traffic. If we want that to be part of our inline layer, we can just drag and drop it. Check this out. We'll take the existing rule 2 right now and drag it up and just put it in between 1.1 and the current 1.2. Let go of the mouse. And now that becomes the new rule 1.2. So now when the firewall gets traffic sourced from either of those two going to either of those two, that'll be considered a match on the parent, and that'll cause the individual child rules to begin to be processed in order until there's a match. And if there's not a match on 1.1 or 1.2, there will be a match on 1.3 because it's the cleanup rule. It says traffic from anywhere, going to anywhere, any service, go ahead and drop it. And for our lab environment, I'm also going to specify that I want to do logging for each of these as well. So in the track column, I'm going to specify for the subrule 1.1 and 1.2 that I want to have logging enabled. And also let's do that for the cleanup rule 1.3, just so that in the lab environment we could go back to our logs and see exactly what's happening when packets are being dropped, or when packets are being permitted based on these rules, we can have that log history to confirm it. All right, so now regarding collapsing, we could take this parent rule and click on the arrow next to the parent, and that would collapse all the children. We could also collapse the section, which gives us more real estate to focus on the other areas that we might want to work with. So let's also create some inline layers regarding the specifics for user traffic. Now, we already have a rule 2 here. What we could do is we could, in the action column, we could go ahead and use the drop down. And from here, we could go ahead and hover over inline layer and then simply select new layer. Now, if on the previous layer we had identified that we wanted it to be reusable, it would also show up here as an existing inline layer that we could then use. So let's create a new layer just for the user traffic. So we'll click on new layer, and we'll name it user traffic inline layer. And down here under sharing, I'm going to click the checkbox that says multiple policies and rules can use this layer. And that way we can reuse or recycle this inline layer in multiple parts of our policy if we need the same sets of rights. So we'll click on OK. And by default, it's creating for us a single child rule 2.1, which is the cleanup rule. So if we wanted to add the specifics for our rules before that cleanup, we could click on 2.1, we could right click here and use the drop down, or we could use the shortcuts up here on the menu bar. So we could add rule above by using this icon. So we'll click on this to add a rule above the cleanup rule. So we have a new rule 2.1, and let's call that one DNS. And let's add one more rule. So we'll click on 2.1. This time I'll click on the icon for add rule below. Let's call that one web services. And then regarding what we want to allow, I'm going to drag and drop inside for both of those and outside for both of those. We could also be more granular here as well. If you want specific permissions, for example, for a subnet or for a specific host, those could all be part of the subrules for the inline layer. And then as far as permissions go, I'm just going to drag and drop DNS to our DNS child rule, and I'll drop HTTP and HTTPS for our web services. And then in the parent rule, I'm just going to click on each of those and hit the delete key, because in the parent rule, I'm not looking for those specific services in this example. In the parent rule, I'm simply looking for a traffic flow of traffic that's coming in from the inside and going to the outside if that's a match. Then I want to use the inline layer called user traffic inline layer, at which point it'll go to 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3 until there's a match. And also for this inline layer, I want to specify that the subrules should be to accept or allow that traffic for 2.1 and 2.2. So we'll make those changes. And let's also, for tracking purposes, let's turn on logging for each of those as well as for the cleanup rule. And from an educational perspective, It's going to be really handy to be able to go through the logs and identify when a packet was permitted or dropped because we have logging enabled on each of those rules. And then for the final cleanup for that section, we simply have one rule, rule number 3. So if network traffic does not match any of the previous rules that are either explicit or implied, the cleanup rule is going to catch that traffic, and the action of drop says the packet's not going to continue any further. So if we expand all of our sections here, and then we expand each of the parent rules so we can see the inline layers, we can double check our work and then go ahead and click on Publish, give that a moment. And now that that's published, we can go ahead and install the policy, and we're still pushing out the policy just to Firewall 1. So with only Firewall 1 selected here, we'll go ahead and click on Install and give that a few moments to complete. And that says it was successful. That's great. And then let's do a quick check. From our management computer, let's connect via HTTPS from our management computer over to Firewall 2. And as we do so, as the rules are checked on the gateway, because the source is the management PC and the destination is going to be Firewall 2, because that parent rule is a match, the gateway will then go ahead and process the child rules, which are part of the inline layer. So when rule 1.1 is checked, because we are coming from the management PC, we are going to Firewall 2, and it is HTTPS, it's going to allow that traffic, and as a result, in the log, we should see the log show that the traffic was permitted based on rule 1.1 being matched. So let's test that. And over here on the left of the desktop, we have a shortcut for the web user interface for Firewall 2. So we'll go ahead and double click on that. That's a very good sign. The fact that this came up indicates that we have connectivity. So I'm going to close this browser window, and let's go back to our Smart Console. We'll click on rule 1.1, and then down here we'll click on the tab for logs right here. And let me bring that up just a little bit so we have a little more real estate. And let me arrange these columns a little bit so we can see everything. And if we just grabbed one of those packets, we can just double click on it to see the details. So here it's showing us the source address, the destination address, the well-known port of TCP port 443, as well as information on the rule where that matched, including the fact that it was 1.1 specifically, that was the rule that was matched that permitted that traffic. In this nugget, we've taken a look at the step-by-step of implementing section titles as well as inline layers as part of our security policy. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.